So now it is my pleasure to introduce our last conversation this afternoon with two elected officials who play a major positive role in the Bay Area region and in our success, Congressman John Garamendi and San Mateo County Supervisor Dave Pine. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Garamendi and Supervisor Pine.
Good afternoon. It's a little better. So it's my pleasure to share the stage with Congressman Garamendi today, and we're going to talk a little bit about dirt and mud.
Dirt and mud, okay.
You know, as an elected official, I didn't think I would be spending quite as much time on dirt and mud, but it's an important topic and one we'll have a dialogue about. The Congressman has a firm stop at 1:45, so we don't have too much time. We'll have some dialogue, and if we have time, we'll ask for a question or two, so you might keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So Congressman Garamendi, we're also, very pleased that WRDA included the Section 1122, which requires the Corps to do the 10 pilot projects to show that we can use dredge materials in productive ways beyond dumping them. And you were a big part of getting that in the bill, and we're grateful. And I thought you might have some reflections on kind of what that took, or any story behind the headline.
Well, the story behind the headline starts maybe 20-some years ago. It started here in California, and perhaps some of you in this room were involved in that at the time. Studies were being done in the mid-90s about, actually well into the 80s, about climate change, about what the impacts of it might be. I was then, in the mid-90s, Deputy Secretary at the United States Department of Interior. Got a call from the White House, why don't you come on over here for a meeting, went over, and there were the deputies from Commerce, Agriculture, Department of Defense, Department of Interior, and the White House environmental officer, and we said, okay, the Kyoto conference is coming up, and you guys figure out what the American policy ought to be. We divided up the responsibilities, and I had the U.S. Geological Survey and a few other from the department, and we went to work. Among the other things, not discovered, but once again picked up the issue, if the climate warms, then the sea level will rise, and some maps were put together, some rudimentary maps at that time of what it would mean to various parts of America, and it did not look good. Some of the early maps of the Bay and the region around here were frightening. In the intervening years, the maps have become more sophisticated, and the problem is not something in the future, the problem is today. And it's going to get even more so in the future. Now that's where we start. So what do you do about it? Well, let's see. Well, we can deal with climate change. That's another subject, integral to this one, but nonetheless a major part of it. By the way, our current government in Washington, that is the administration, doesn't believe in science. I was talking to one of my most conservative members of Congress, and I said, how do you deal with this? And he said, I believe that the climate is warming, and here's how I tell my constituents. He said, we could argue about this, but we can't argue about the thermometer. I said, yeah, you got it right. So where does this fit into reuse and dredging? Most directly. And this issue has changed over time. Back in the 90s, nobody wanted the dredging material. Nobody. And we had some ideas about where it could be used, and nobody wanted it, didn't want to talk about it. Take it, dump it out Alcatraz, and let's not think about it. Those times have changed. The new law that's in place basically has 10 projects around the United States for the Army Corps of Engineers to test the theory. Same cost-share relationships. Can this material be used to address restoration, climate change, sea level rise, and the like? The answer is it can. We don't need a study, but the reality is it can. Now the Army Corps of Engineers will select 10 projects. One of those should be in the Bay Area. Exactly where in the Bay Area? I understand you've got about a dozen different locations that you'd like to use. Good. Pick one, push hard on it. We'll see if we can get the Corps to go along with it. Discussions, I think there's some representatives from the Corps around here. We've got to figure out how to pay for it at the local level. The 35% cost share is still there. We really don't need to prove this. We already know it. It's already been done in the Bay Area. So we're going to get on with it. And around the nation, there is a very, very high demand for material to be used to deal with the rising sea level.
I could ask you about the selection process for picking the pilots. I've read that there's 94 applicants, and of course we have a couple from the Bay Area, and in particular we've heard earlier about the Resilient San Francisco Bay proposal, which would move the material from the channels to restoration sites where we've had subsidence. It also has this cool experiment where we hope to test depositing sediment offshore from marshes and see if that could help replenish the sediment supply. So in any event, we think it's a strong proposal, but we have 93 competitors. So any advice on how we can improve our prospects?
Yes, there are some ways you can improve your project. Or first of all, have a good project. To the extent that it's experimental, make it practical. Something that can then be replicated wherever else these projects might be. Secondly, the Bay Area has a very dynamic, a very powerful congressional delegation. Work closely with them. I understand Mike Thompson's representative somewhere in the room out there. I guess they ate and ran. Anyway, so work closely with all of us. That delegation will stand behind a project, work with it. Obviously, you've got to work closely with the Corps of Engineers. I recommend whatever issues are out there, you address those issues early on in early discussions with the Corps so that when it comes time for a decision, there isn't a blank place on the decision map that the Corps has to make. So involve all of us.
And I guess a related issue always is funding for the Corps. As I understand it, their budget in the SFA has been flat for many years, and I think some people have the fear that if we were successful in obtaining the pilot, is the budget also going to go up with that, or will we continue to deal with this flat budget? I guess generally speaking, are your colleagues, particularly the ones you serve on in your key committees, appreciative of beneficial reuse and how we need to change this paradigm and willing to try to get some more money for it?
Well, the issue with beneficial reuse has always been the cost.
Yes.
It's a whole lot cheaper to pick the mud, spoils, whatever, pick it up, take it out to Alcatraz and let the tide take care of it until you get out to the San Francisco bar, and now we got another problem. But anyway, that's just cheaper. And the Army Corps of Engineers has always had and probably always will have a financial issue. And they want to spread the money around as far as possible. Which brings me to an option. There were the hurricanes last year. As part of the effort to deal with the hurricanes in Texas and Florida as well as Puerto Rico, there's about $70+ billion that was appropriated, emergency funding for that purpose. And in the language, we were able to put into the language that money would be available for flood repair of levees and flood systems in those states that had 2 presidential emergency declarations for flooding. 2 of them in the previous 2 years. Turns out that there are just a few states that meet that qualification. Why was 2 selected? Because that's the number that existed in California, and therefore there is money available for flood projects. And it's rather broadly defined as to what a flood project is, to repair or to build resiliency into the future. If I had a restoration project, I would consider it a flood project.
That's I think an idea that's has been circulating with some of our restoration partners. Maybe that's a unique opportunity as opposed to the WRDA appropriation process, which
Well, word
seems
is
uncertain.
tight, funds are tight, funds are good this year. We did a 2-year budget deal, piled in a lot of money, a lot more than was available. That's why we're going to have a $1 trillion deficit this year and a $1 trillion deficit next year. Nonetheless, the deal is cut, forget about the debt, spend the money. The deficit hawks are going to come back. They just disappeared so they could pass the tax bill, but the tax bill is passed, and now the deficit hawks are returning.
Right.
But this year is okay. We're doing the 19 fiscal year budget, 19-20 fiscal year budget right now. Things will be okay for the 19 year, which begins in October. However, this time next year, we're working on the 20 fiscal year. You don't want to be involved in that. You want your money now. Don't wait for 20, because the fiscal hawks are back. The deficit's $1 trillion a year, and it's going to be bad, really, really bad. And just to make it even worse, they want to do additional tax cuts. Go figure. Therefore, anybody here had parents that were gold miners in the 1850s, 60s? My ancestors made a fundamental mistake. They went looking for the gold where it was not. So the lesson today is, if you're looking for money, go where it is. I think I told you where it is. It is in the emergency appropriation for disaster relief.
Okay, good advice. Another issue that always comes up when we talk about beneficial reuse is the actual process by which we dredge. And there's the hydraulic dredging that causes concerns with species, particularly the Delta smelt. And so there's a desire to use more of the clamshell process. But as I understand, the Corps doesn't have a ship of that kind. And meanwhile, we're having difficulties with getting some of our channels dredged. The outer Richmond Shoal and the Pinole Shoal are on alternate years. So do you have any perspective on this issue you could share with us?
The one thing I have are opinions. Whether they're valid and whether they're useful opinions or not, you can judge. But the reality is that it really pays to understand exactly what the Endangered Species Act is and know it in detail. Now, 2 years ago, we passed a major piece of legislation dealing with water resources in California called the WIN Act. Senator Feinstein was the lead on it, and I took the lead on the House side in the detail piece of it about how to write it. Because of my experience back at the Department of Interior, I'm familiar with the Endangered Species Act, which does allow the biological opinions to be updated based upon current science. Most biological opinions that exist today are a slice of time, some often a decade or more ago. We just talked about climate change. Things are changing, and the entire ecological systems changes with the climate and the changes of water flows and the like. So if you use science in conjunction with the Endangered Species Act, the biological opinions can be modified based upon what is occurring in real time. Delta smelt, are they there or are they not there? If they're not there, then you can do some actions. If they are there, you can't. And so you begin to look at these issues in real time, not based upon some historic slice of time, which is the way most biological opinions have come to be. So the point here is, if you've got a problem, Pinole Shores or the outer Richmond, and the biological opinions say that the Delta smelt are here at this time of the year, well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So apply science, that is, observe, are the fish there? Yes, well then, okay, you're not going to use a suction dredge. If the fish aren't, then maybe you could use a suction dredge. So that's what I'm suggesting here, is that in all of these issues where you're up against these kinds of restrictions, apply current science, current observation. You cannot and should not destroy the species, but you can live within their life cycle, because they're not always there. And so they move. And when they're not there, suck it up. That is, suck up the mud. So anyway, that's kind of a solution that's now being applied in the Delta in a major way with regard to the export of water. We're into the second, this will be the third water year coming up. It seems to work. It's going to be made more sophisticated through time, but it is a way of dealing with these issues. So I would recommend that to you as a matter of dealing with biological opinions. You can deal with biological opinions, and they would be modified by real science in real time.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing.
Okay, please.
I was looking at some of the data here, and that is that the Army Corps of Engineers has its own dredge. Cool. There are other folks that have dredges. And so I would not rely on the Army Corps of Engineers dredge to do all the work that needs to be done on channel maintenance throughout this region. And if the issue comes down where the dredge isn't available, then contract out to dredging companies and the like who could just as well do the work.
Do you think we could ever get Congress to buy us a nice clamshell dredge for the bay? We would call it the USS Garamendi, if you could.
Chances are it wouldn't work, or it would sink if it had my name on it. I would recommend that you contract with private entities who have dredges, rather than look to the military, in this case the Army Corps of Engineers, to own their own dredge. Capital outlay is very, very difficult to come by, and I would just recommend that you go to contracting. The dredging, you've got annual dredging on some of the channels, but not all the channels. And therefore, the demand curve for a dredger is going to change over time, and that's where your private sector contractors come in. And it may be a better price.
You know, going to just a little different level, one thing that I think about, and many of us in the room are thinking about, is with climate change and sea level rise, the rules and regulations and processes that we've put in place were designed for a different time. It's our environment is going to change really radically, so it gives rise to the question as to whether these rules and programs need updating. So here locally, for example, I have the privilege of serving on BCDC. We're in the process of looking at our bay fill regulations, because of course the mission historically of BCDC is to promote public access and prevent bay fill, but bay fill is going to be necessary as part of the restoration projects and sea level rise defense. So we have to really relook at that. And then another thing that I'm excited about is that a number, the regulators in the Bay Area are looking at coming together to work on permits in a more collaborative way, basically creating a kind of a focused permitting effort on restoration projects, because with Measure AA passed, the pipeline for these projects is really going to increase. So I know not likely to be changing a lot of laws. Well, maybe not. I guess the question is, at the federal level, or are you and your colleagues thinking about whether we could revise some of our federal laws in light of this new world?
What was it? 2 nights ago, we were talking about the reality. We're doing the National Defense Authorization Act, of which some of this is relevant, but there was the most lengthy debate in the National Defense Authorization Act markup, which is the final amending process before we pass it out of committee in the House Armed Services Committee. It's about 16 hours. We sit there and go through several hundred amendments. The most lengthy debate was about the changing times, high times, otherwise known as marijuana, and the effect that it has in the military. Is this off base? No. It's really on base because the federal laws have to change as the world in which we live changes. In this case in point, very conservative committee, but it was a very, very interesting discussion about how does the federal government and the military deal with the reality of the legalization of marijuana. Similarly, the issue of climate change. The federal laws, the environmental laws, the biological opinions, all of these things, water resources, dams, you name it, do not contemplate the radical changes that are occurring today as a result of climate. We could talk for hours here about forestry issues. We're passing in the omnibus legislation that passed 2 months ago now, there is a section to redesign the way in which the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Reclamation deal with forest issues in the reality of climate change. How to deal with dead and dying trees and fire breaks and more important, and just as importantly, the funding for forest resiliency. Similarly, in water and all of these areas, we have to modify the federal laws along the way so that we can accommodate the reality of our world in this changing climate. You name it. You can go right on down the list of everything the federal government does, and you will find the necessity of change. Healthcare, tropical diseases in California, on and on and on.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to go ahead and allow members of the audience to pose some questions to the Congressman. So we can go ahead and take some of those now.
I can't believe there's no
You
question.
got a question
Behind you.
back in the corner.
Mike has a question again. Intellectual property rights.
Your expertise on the Endangered Species Act would really be helpful. The Endangered Species Act is going to kill us in San Francisco Bay and being outdated for what we need to do. And as we need a strong environmentalist like yourself to encourage all the agencies to think about how do we fit the Endangered Species Act together in a big way with where we want to take the bay in the future. As you said, with new science, we have some room to maneuver on that, and your ideas as to how to do that would be interesting.
Most people think the Endangered Species Act is the stop sign. It's not. I would urge anyone that has anything to do with the Endangered Species Act to actually read it and to understand that built into the Endangered Species Act is significant flexibility. The problem occurs in that we do not use it in its most flexible form, and the regulating agencies do not work together to either develop the underlying biological opinion or to work with that biological opinion. So the point here is that the regulatory agencies, state, federal, all of them, that may be relevant to, I don't know, let's just say fish in the river, which is like all of them, perhaps with the exception of air quality, they need to work together. And the earlier that they begin to work together on a specific issue, for example, the Pinot shores and the Delta smelt, the more likely it is that a resolution will be found. What normally and unfortunately happens is that the federal Fish and Wildlife will go over here and do its analysis, and the state will go over and do that, and quite possibly the NIMS and the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and on and on and on. Each one will do its own analysis. And then they come together and their database is wildly different. And then they spend the next decade arguing over which database is most useful or accurate. So my point here is that whenever a project is underway, bring everybody together initially. All of the regulatory agencies, Corps of Engineers, whomever, sit down at the table and decide how are you going to look at this issue. What are the relevant factors or the relevant issues? What are they? Put them on the table. And then decide how shall we analyze this. There'll be differences of opinion, but at least you'll start with a common understanding of the problem and hopefully a common set of observations. And then you're much more likely to figure it out. And as I said before, every biological opinion is subject to change based upon new science, new evidence. And that can be built into it without a great deal of reanalysis, as long as it's fundamentally sound. And the issue of fundamental soundness is that there's a general agreement among the regulatory agencies that this is how we're going to look at it. Here are the factors. Here's how the observations will be made. And I highly recommend that. Otherwise, you're going off in different directions. The general thrust of federal law over the last, we were trying to do this in the 90s, is to pull the agencies together. Not easily done, stovepipes, all of that, but the regional directors or the national directors, whatever it happens to be, need to force that kind of unity early on. Okay.
And as I was mentioning, that's exactly the sort of model we are going to hopefully pioneer here in concurrent with the Measure AA projects. It's to actually have the regulators sit together a certain number of times a month, have a common application, to have a goal, timeline, objectives. So yeah, that's something we're going to try to make happen here in the Bay Area.
Dave, we have one last question. Congressman Garamendi actually has a Wolf Blitzer interview coming up here. So one last question. Walter Yupp.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi, it's great to see you again.
Excuse me,
by the way.
that microphone really requires your up close and personal attention.
Okay. Is there any chance navigation could get into the emergency supplemental act that was passed? It's about $5 billion, if I can recall, for this year.
I'm not exactly sure I understood you. I caught navigation.
Is there any chance navigation can be applied for the emergency supplemental bill? It's about $5 billion this year.
If you mean by navigation dredging, is that correct? Dredging, is that what you mean by navigation? Be creative. I think I said this a while ago, and be creative. Dredging to build a more resilient flood protected area. Kind of get where I'm going here? Perhaps. I don't know, pick your community here that, I don't know, let's take the Oakland Airport, which stopped by my office a while ago and they go, oh my God, we're going to flood. Well, yes, along with San Francisco Airport. So is there a flood control project at the Oakland International Airport? Yeah. Where's the material come from? Be creative. The problem the Corps of Engineers has is personnel. They're stressed. They don't have the personnel to deal with $70 billion of programs from Houston, Texas to Puerto Rico. But California's in line for that money, so I would be creative. And yes, it's possible. Okay?
All right, well, I think our time may be up. We appreciate your time very much, Congressman, and your ongoing advocacy on these issues.
Thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, so anyway, we'll be in touch.